So we're going to talk more about the future, and we can talk about water. We've been talking about it all day, but I hope we also branch out, because every year the council's trying to build a story. We've talked about some of these issues: urbanization, the growth of youth populations, nutrition, climate change. It's a complex picture that we are working on. And so we're always looking forward to say, how can we build on this, sort of support the conversation and move forward? And so I hope we do a bit of both, a bit of water and a bit of other issues. And I'm going to start, because we're on water, I'm going to start with you. Khalid Bomba from the Agricultural Transformation Agency in Ethiopia. Transformation has a lot of dimensions. And I know that you are balancing many things across the Transformation Agency. How does water fit in? And what is its role in this transformation idea?
Mm-hmm. So there's always a challenge in speaking in the last panel about a broad topic, like what does water mean for agriculture, because you feel like everything's been said already.
Right.
But as people, and I'll try to contextualize my response for Ethiopia. But as most people have said throughout the day, without water, there is no agriculture. Mm-hmm. So it is fundamental to the agricultural system in Ethiopia. But when I think about water in Ethiopia's agricultural context, surprising to most people is the fact that when you think about water for agriculture at the aggregate level, Ethiopia surprisingly, on average, has sufficient amount of water for its agricultural sector at an aggregate national level. Unfortunately, it's concentrated, both geographically as well as temporally. Right? So you get somewhere around 90% of the water in a 3 to 4 month period in the highlands of the country. And even that is very variable. So when it comes can vary from time to time, because climate change, unfortunately, in Ethiopia is very real. Yeah. So our farmers have to deal with how do you actually manage those water resources as effectively as possible. And we've been thinking about that from two particular dimensions. One is, how do you deal with the water, with the rainwater in the most effective way? Because as similar to most African countries, somewhere around 94–95% of Ethiopia's agriculture is rain-fed. So solutions similar to the one we heard about earlier this morning, related to rain gauges, is one of the solutions that we've been rolling out throughout the country, as well as agrometeorological services. But beyond that, it's also about agronomic practices. For example, using tirages and other just basic practices to be able to harvest that water within the agronomic practices of the farmers. Also looking at improved varieties of seeds. Thinking about the timing of planting based on a cropping calendar. That's not necessarily based on what your father used to do and your grandfather used to do, but rather using the science and data of when is the rain coming, when am what am I expecting in the coming weeks and months. But then, of course, and I hope we get a chance to talk a little bit more about it, it's about irrigation. Yeah. Ultimately, we have to move towards a more irrigated farming system, because our farmers can't be dependent on rain all the time, and they actually need to produce more than once a year. Thankfully, the soil and the agroecology does allow us to do that. Water is the limiting factor. So we've got to make sure that we use the abundance of water that we have, but that comes in a very concentrated way, in a smarter, more efficient manner throughout the year.
I do want to come back and talk about water, and I want to talk about the mix of small and large, because there's been a big discussion today about small versus larger scale infrastructure projects, so come back on that. Roy, over to you, Managing Director for Food at Rockefeller. I want to ask kind of a question here that relates to the conversation all day long, which was, we've talked about productivity, and maybe the fact that productivity alone has taken us in a direction where you have perhaps a challenge of having a lot of calories, but that may not be what we should be optimizing for. We just talked about water efficiency. We've talked about nutrition. So a lot of different goals. How do we need to be thinking about sort of this systems view of the world, and why is Rockefeller focusing on food versus agriculture, which is kind of the historic Rockefeller orientation?
Thanks, Alesha. So by the way, it's at the first day of spring, which is also the Persian New Year and Baha'i New Year. So Happy New Year, everyone. It's be talking about the future on the first day of spring is, I think, appropriate. Balancing all of those things, I think, is, depends on what your ultimate goal is. The Rockefeller Foundation's mission is to promote the well-being of humanity. and both now and in the future. And therefore, it's not as, there are trade-offs, but I think they're less, we can often fall into false dichotomies because we're either short-sighted or we're thinking in a limited way.
Yeah.
And I think we have to start looking at, this is a multi-objective optimization problem. It's very challenging, but it's not impossible. But it requires each local, regional area of the world, because agriculture is so diverse, to figure out what that means, that optimization will mean for those people. Ultimately, people have to be the protagonists of their own development and make those decisions. At the Rockefeller Foundation, I think there's a real dearth of vision right now. People can't imagine, we are so surrounded by dystopia and kind of dark feelings that things are going wrong. And we need to start creating visions of where things, of what it could look like if we made the right decisions, because that unlocks hope and that unlocks creativity. But we're all quite narrow, and we have to start thinking in terms of systems. So we're going to be launching a few really interesting initiatives in the next few months, but I can't talk about them here, but you heard it first. And we'll talk a little bit later.
Okay, thank you. Fola Aina is one of our next-gen delegates, and I got to hear his story a bit yesterday. And he has been all over the world studying these challenges, trying to figure out how to become a leader that can really rise to the challenges we've been describing today. And right now you're pursuing a doctorate in security and development. How does water and agriculture fit into a security focus?
Thank you very much for the question.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Well, I would just say that basically it's important to understand that the problems the world is confronted with today are very multi-sectoral. So they aren't in isolation, but it's also important to understand that to address security in itself, we need to be able to understand food security as well. So as against broader national security, it's important to understand that food security is also a very important component of national security. And sometimes the problems we are confronted with, like I said, don't necessarily require military solutions from a security perspective, but also they require new forms of thinking, which is what leadership is all about. And so if we're going to be addressing, say, for instance, Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, to some extent, yes, the problem might be military, but at the same time, it might also require new forms of thinking with regards to addressing agricultural issues. That is the mainstay of the local economy in the region. So having to adopt an all-encompassing approach to these issues gives us new perspectives into how we can address some of these problems. So yes, I would say food security, agriculture are very important components of security, and especially in fragile states, and having a holistic approach to addressing these things would be, in the long run, to everyone's benefit, essentially.
I want to connect something you just said with something you said, Roy, which is you talked a little bit about Boko Haram. The last panel mentioned youth and the need to create youth employment. I think oftentimes when we talk about insecurity, that's part of the narrative, is that young people don't have hope. They don't have a vision for how they're going to be able to make money and support a family. And I would ask you, and maybe also you, Khalid, I mean, to talk about how agriculture is seen for young people in Nigeria, in Ethiopia. Are we shifting in that direction? Is it seen as a hopeful opportunity? And I don't know if you want to go first.
Sure. I mean, I'd say not yet. And part of the challenge is in the way that we define agriculture.
Okay.
Because if we're thinking of agriculture purely as what happens on the farm, then for most youth, what they see is not what they want to do. Because what they see in most smallholder farms in Ethiopia and most of Africa is an ox-drawn plow, and that their fathers used and their grandfathers used, and that's frankly not very appealing.
Technology from the Bible.
yeah, exactly. And but if we broaden our thinking a little bit and say agriculture might start, actually it doesn't even start on the farm, but there are so many parts of the supply chain, agricultural value chain, where there are interesting job opportunities. Be they as an input dealer, or be it as a mechanized service provider, be it in grading and sorting, be it in logistics and transportation. all of those are part of the agricultural sector.
Yeah.
And I think we've got to frame it more broadly and say be part of that solution rather than focusing purely what happens on the farm. And even what happens on the farm itself has to be modernized if we really do want to move smallholder farmers into the global food supply chain.
Yeah, fair. Fola.
Well, I think in the case of Nigeria, the greatest challenge right now is the fact that a lot of the young people are looking for jobs. And so the government is trying very hard to ensure that more young people go into the agricultural space. But then to do that, there would be a need to try to make the sector more attractable for young people. And of course, most young people, especially in these days of social media proliferation, wouldn't want to be seen holding hoes and cutlasses, going to the farms. So there's a need to try to make it a bit more appealing to the youth. And so what the youth who are going into agriculture right now in Nigeria, what they are doing is looking for very innovative ways to get other youth into agriculture. So a good case in view would be this organization called Farm Crowdy.
Farm Crowdy.
Yeah, Farm Crowdy. What they do is basically they give people who wear, who have regular jobs, white-collar jobs, who wear suits and ties, they give them an opportunity to be farmers in some ways and also investors. And so just through an app, you can go on the app, you can say, oh, I want to be a poultry farmer, or I want to be a rice farmer, and I don't necessarily have to work on the farm, but I've got the resources and I just want to partner with a local farmer. So I would provide the resources, and within a span of say 6 months or 8 months, I get my cut. So that way, technically, there's they appear to be virtual farmers.
Yep.
And that helps, flexibility of work, and all of that, as against physically going to work, in the farm. So the whole idea would be to, like I said, to basically try to create innovative ways to make the sector more attractive for young people.
Yeah, and funny story about Farm Crowdy. For those of you who were at the AGRA meeting in Kigali this year, they presented. They were one of the pitch companies. And you can go invest, right? You can invest a small amount of money, like you said, individuals can. And within a couple of minutes, the presentation starting, the website was totally, all of the opportunities had been cashed out because they basically had gotten so many donors to their platform. It'd be worth checking to see if they have any opportunities available. Roy, I'm going to go to you and ask you a question about innovation, because you've spent some time thinking about how do you create an environment for innovation. You just talked about creativity, that we need to bring creativity in the space. What do we need to have in place in order to truly be innovative in either the technologies we're creating or in the way that we're interacting and partnering with each other?
There's so many dimensions to innovation. What Khalid is doing is actually very, very innovative, because it's not just technology innovation, but a business model and creating capacity in a way that unlocks incredible potential. By the way, Khalid is one of my agricultural food heroes. Ethiopia, as a result of the ATA, has grown about 10%. The yields in Ethiopia have grown 10% in the last 5 years, every single year. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. And it's because of his work and his team's work. So I think, there's some really shining lights out there, and he's going to win a prize sometime in his life. I said it first here. So let me share, get the younger folks to talk about innovation.
Okay. So again, with innovation, I would say there have been some groundbreaking innovations coming out. Again, I think sometimes the problem has always been that it's not that we don't have the right numbers with a number of farmers who are going to farming, but most of the time, I think there's always a gap between these farmers getting their products to the final consumers. Again, in countries like, in a few countries in Africa, there's always been a problem with bad road networks. And so half the time when farmers produce, they find it very difficult to get their produce to the local consumers because of the cost of transportation. And so midway, they lose about half of their products because there aren't enough storage facilities. And of course, the roads might be bad. And so there have been some new innovations in the areas of medicine, for instance, where drones have been used to transport medical supplies. And I think this kind of thinking can also be integrated into the agricultural sector. Again, very interestingly, there is this new, there's something called Drinkable Books. So it's a book, and it's got filtration sheets, basically, and it gives you information on agriculture, sanitation, water, and also the sheets are enough to provide you with water, each reader with water for about 4 years.
Wow.
So that's quite innovative, that's quite creative. Also, we have solutions where people are beginning to, this is happening already in places like China, where people are beginning to tap the moisture from fog and converting it to drinkable water. You know, and also, I mean, so many other innovations. So I think some of these things should be supported through more investments in R&D, and also I think even more importantly, the governments should provide the enabling environments for this kind of innovations to thrive. Going forward.
Just one other note on a really good fundamental transformative innovation, I think, requires vision and imagination. And you know, it's so interesting. I don't know how many people have seen The Minority Report, but it's a movie about the future. It's another dystopian movie, but interesting anyway. And they actually had to create an entire world before they actually wrote the script. But as a result of creating that world, they actually came up with 100 patents out of that. And because they were unconstrained by the limitations of the current world, and then they were able to create something. I think we are so constrained by our current limitations, and we have to find new ways to kind of go beyond that so we can actually imagine true system transformation. And so I think we got to work on that.
Khalid, you're working on transformation. I want to hear about the irrigation piece, but I also want you to talk about that process in Ethiopia.
Sure. So maybe two types of innovations that we've been working on. One that is driven by technology, and the others that are driven by kind of business process innovations. When it comes to technology, it's really about, again, how do we use technology to improve essentially data availability for decision making? And maybe let me point to two very quick approaches that we've used, both of them which use satellite and remote sensing. So one, Ethiopia for 30 years was using only 2 types of fertilizer throughout the country, irrespective of whether you're growing wheat, maize, whatever product, 3,000 meters above sea level, at sea level, it's 100 kg of DAP and 100 kg of urea. And we thought that clearly doesn't make sense. After 30 years, the soil is just not going to be responsive. So we used remote sensing and satellite technology to actually analyze the soil nutrients and create a digital soil map for every single district in the country. And it took us 5 years, but now farmers have tailored fertilizer recommendations by the district that they can more reliably ensure that what they're investing will get in return, but also ensures a more sustainable approach to using an organic fertilizer. We're using the same technology on water for shallow groundwater mapping. So not only identifying where the water is and how much water there is, but most importantly, the actual recharge rates so that we know exactly how much water you can access every single year. Now, in addition to these kinds of technology-led innovations that allow farmers to make better decisions, there's also business processes. So related to the water mapping, using some of the lessons that we heard about this morning from California, how do you get communities to be part of the decision-making process in using this kind of common pool resource? And people like Eleanor Ostrom, won a Nobel Prize for this, but it's about engaging local communities to create the rules of the game rather than expecting the government to do that. And in Ethiopia, that's about water user associations. So that's a business process on how to use a common pool resource. Another one in terms of business process is the mechanism that we used in Ethiopia when it comes to input distribution. When we said there's something going on here with farmers buying inputs where they don't have access to credit. So we put financial institutions in between the farmer and the place where they actually buy the fertilizer. So the farmers go to a financial institution and pay for the fertilizer in a financial institution, and then get a voucher that then they would get the fertilizer for at the input dealer. What that did was put the financial institution in the middle, which allowed for credit to be available, but what we didn't expect was savings would be mobilized at the same time. So that business process of putting a financial institution between the farmer and the input dealer created financial inclusion. So sometimes there is additional benefits that come from essentially changing the business model of how people interact within the supply chain itself.
That's great. I am going to go to the first question I saw come up here because it's a bit of a, we're going to zoom out a little bit. It said, what's your definition of a food-secure future? That's an interesting question in the context of the diet conversation we've been having, but also natural resource strains. It goes back to that first question. Is there anything new that you would put on the table as we think about what food security is? Should we be thinking about it differently? Roy, do you want to?
Well, I think that conversation around food security has to be broadened. You know, when you're looking at the trends, we actually have been making pretty good movement against undernutrition. The trends are going down as child stunting is going down. There's some real progress. Obviously, it's not there yet, and we need to, you know, there's challenges. What we're totally not winning is the war on human health and human diet. And as I think the previous panel mentioned, you know, we have double-digit growths of obesity, of non-communicable diseases as a result of diet. 60 to 70% of all non-communicable diseases are now diet-related. I had a slide up, and this is data that I think we just developed, is, you know, unless you, we just did this with the Institute Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is the best health data institution in the world now. And they just did this analysis. 4 of the top 6 global risk factors for mortality are diet related. We're not winning that war, and we don't actually know how to bend those curves. And the curves everywhere in the world, Africa, India, China, the United States, are going up. And so food security cannot just be about quantity. It has to be about quality, because we're creating so many problems around human health.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe let me add 2 things, because I completely agree with Roy that, you know, for the past 20, 30, 50 years, we've been focused on quantity, and quality has to be part of it. But I would add 2 additional things, and one of them we've heard over and over again, which is sustainability, from an environmental, from a social point of view, inclusiveness, and then finally, I'd also add institutional resilience. And by that, what I'm talking about is the ability to adapt to change. And that ability comes from building local institutions that are able to interpret the context and the data that we're gathering on a regular basis to say, what policy changes do we need? Because things are dynamic. They change constantly. And unfortunately, our local institutions in Africa don't have the capacity to interpret what's happening around us and say, here are the policy changes that we must make to adapt to those changes and that information that we're gathering. We're always reactive rather than proactive. So I think that piece of kind of institutional resilience is something that we've got to build within Africa.
Do you see tools coming around for that?
I was just going to say that also any conversation that has to do with achieving global food security would have to involve every single stakeholder on the table. This includes women, the youth, it includes farmers, it includes policymakers, and also it includes the private sector. Anything outside of these, we cannot achieve it because it's everyone's concern. Everyone is involved, you know, in this entire process. So it's important that everyone is carried along because it's a mutually linked concern for everyone.
Yeah. Well, we have time for one question. I'm going to take a liberty and go a tiny bit over. And then there's going to be a reception. You guys can talk to all of them over drinks. I'm going to look out in the audience, see if we have a question. And if we don't, we will just go have drinks. And we will let everyone go talk to these folks on their own. All right. Well, we took the question from online, so I will thank the panel if you would join me in thanking them. All right.